Hello, so today's presentation is about strengths, narrative and solution practice. So starting off firstly with the roots. So certainly these perspectives are informed by postmodernism. So this kind of questioning approach to how knowledge is attained and valued. So distinguishing belief from truth. So this kind of skepticism for these grand narratives that are going to seek the truth. So postmodern thinking offers ideas about how power relations are expressed and the way in which people use language. So language is really fundamental to all three of the approaches that we'll look at today. And this brings in this idea of social constructionism. So social constructionism is a postmodern perspective which believes that people construct reality based on their experiences in the social world. So all three of these perspectives focus on being forward-looking and recasting apparent problems by looking for strengths in their present lives. So there's a focus on building resilience with all three of these approaches to practice. And thinking about social psychology studies how individuals constantly interact within social groups that they play a part in, and how relations within and between those groups help to create and maintain people's social identities. So really looking at how those social relationships inform our perspective on the world. So because these ideas draw on postmodern social construction theory, they accept that people can change if their understanding of their social experience changes. So ideas from social psychology and psychological therapies really started to influence approaches. So now moving on to the strengths-based approach, which originated in the 1940s in North America with Bertha Capon Reynolds, who started questioning the professionalisation of social work and the position that this put service users in relation to the social worker being the expert. But really these approaches have taken off in the late 90s with Salibi and Rapp, who have pushed forward strengths-based thinking, and it has been very much embraced by particularly adult social care in recent years, within legislation like the CARE Act and approaches to adult social care services. Sometimes the language is around asset-based approach, which I guess an asset relates to a strength, so you might hear that language used as well in some of the literature. But the view is that strengths-based approach will be instrumental in shifting the balance of care and services, focusing more on prevention and independence. So these ideas are quite fundamental for strengths-based practice. Driven from a criticism of the traditional deficit-based approach to working with people, where service users became clients because they had deficits, problems, pathologies and diseases. The strengths-based approach really criticised the social work focus on pathologies, which was fueled by this problem-focused or sometimes called the medical model. And push towards a move to a more strengths-based approach. There was very much a focus on values and how a strengths-based approach was seen to fit much more with the value base of social work. So it is seen as more of a perspective or a lens through which to view a service user and the issues that they might experience. Okay, so here are the 6 principles underpinning a strengths-based approach. So the first is this recognition that every individual, group, family and community has strengths. And that trauma, abuse and adversity may be harmful, but they may be sources of strength and opportunity. So that really does link with some of these ideas around resilience, that actually experiencing adversity can build someone's resilience over time. That we should not assume to know the limits of a person, group or community, and that best practice should be collaborative practice. Every environment, family or community will be abundant with resources, and that social work is about care, caretaking and hope. So you can see that these principles really do resonate with the value base of social work. So it's seen as an empowering approach where it's the service user who is the problem solver, not the social worker. And principles of partnership working are fundamental. So you can see that link with those values. So the idea of strengths is that these can be any personal or environmental attribute that has the potential to stimulate growth and solutions, and that these can be found both within the individual and within the community. So Salibi identified 4 elements of a strengths-based approach to practice. So the first is in the struggle, the harbingers and hints of strength. So this recognises that when people come in to see a social worker, often they're focused on the problem or stressor and don't recognise that they will have strengths. But in telling their stories, people will often drop hints of past successes, coping skills, hopes and aspirations, so that while we're listening to their story, social workers should always be on the lookout for strengths, and when appropriate reflect these back to the client and stimulate the discourse and narratives of resilience and strengths. So as the conversation continues, social workers will need to help clients move from a focus on their problems to a focus more on strengths. So what if someone keeps returning to problem talk? In this situation, the worker listens empathetically, but gently returns them to defining their goals. The third element is acting in context. So this is that clients should identify their hopes and goals and capitalise on their strengths and external resources in moving them towards the goal. Questions to facilitate this process can include survival questions, support questions, exception questions, and possibility questions. And element 4 is a move towards normalising and capitalising on one's strengths. So as people move through their work with you as a social worker, they should become more able to recognise their own strengths and the strengths in their community and their ability to use those strengths. So it starts to kind of normalise this idea that actually there are capacities and resilience that they can use. So now moving on to solution practice. This developed in the 1980s by De Shazer and Berg and others who were based in a therapeutic setting and were influenced by the Mental Research Institute in California, which offered brief intervention talking therapies. It really represented a paradigm shift from traditional approaches in therapy and this psychoanalytic emphasis on problem analysis, which they felt was problematic because analysis is about thinking, not necessarily doing, and they believed that service users are frequently quite proficient at analysis and rumination, and that this looks for causation. Whereas solution-focused approaches are not really interested in understanding the cause, they're interested in looking forward to how things could be better. So the goal was to develop an atheoretical approach, so an approach that develops from observations of therapy, what worked and what didn't work. So it's a constructivist form of therapy in its purest approach. The individual creates their own sense of reality through the use of language, so it brings us back to these ideas of social constructionism. And therefore this reality can be changed through the use of language in contact with professionals. So in their observations they noticed techniques that were commonly used in everyday conversations which they felt were unhelpful to people with their problems, and they tended to stifle change. And so the first of those was reassurance. So, try not to worry about it. it's okay, it'll be okay, those sorts of reassurances they found were not particularly helpful in moving people forward. The second is direction, making suggestions. So what they noticed was that actually that was quite unhelpful. It didn't necessarily move the client towards change. The third is passive support. So I'm just here to listen. That they didn't find that was very helpful. And the last one was taking control. This is what I will do to help. So those were some of the things that they noticed happened sometimes in therapeutic relationships that weren't necessarily very helpful. But they also started to notice some things that were more helpful. So they developed this talking-based activity, which was about asking questions intended to help the talking go in a way that's useful. So it's intended to help people to identify past behaviours that produce positive results in the hope that these can be replicated. So these are the principles underpinning a solution-focused approach, that if it works, don't fix it. If something works better, do more of it. Look for differences that make a difference. If something doesn't work, do something else. And that small changes can lead to bigger changes and build kind of belief. Those were the principles that underpin solution-focused approaches. So the 5 stages of solution-focused work are to begin by describing the problem, but being careful to not ask about the root cause. So the social worker through this process would start to move the client towards more solution-oriented talk. The second stage is to develop well-formulated goals. A picture of a preferred future using some of the techniques that we'll look at. Developing small, specific goals that are perceived by clients as involving their hard work, described at the start of something, that will build on and involve new behaviours rather than the absence of existing behaviours. So it's these goals that are formulated positively as opposed to stopping doing something. It's more about doing something different. Exploring exceptions, so times where the problem wasn't as much of a problem, when there were things that the client was doing that were helpful, as a means of drawing out some of those strengths. At the end of each session, giving feedback, which includes a compliment, a bridging statement and suggestions, which is again one of the techniques with solution-focused approaches. And finally, evaluating progress. So now moving on to narrative practice. This was an approach developed by Michael White and David Epstein in 1990. They were theorists and their background is family therapy, so strong links with systems theory. So the roles in families and expected behaviour is quite fundamental to narrative practice. They were also influenced by the work of Foucault and his work around societal norms and accepted beliefs. So this really the idea that there are hierarchies of power which are used to control, using techniques such as subordination, surveillance, and demonstrating superior knowledge. So some of those ideas went into the development of the approach in terms of thinking about how those things influence the narratives that we develop about ourselves. So the dominant culture and family stories are seen to influence an individual's choices, actions and experiences. So the principles underpinning the approach are that there are dominant cultural and family stories which influence an individual's choices, actions and experiences. So we all have a biography in which we are the central character. Alternative or less dominant stories often struggle to be heard and received by the majority culture. Stories change over time and within communities, and stories and ideas are culturally influenced. So again, these kind of ecological underpinnings, that meaning is relative and changing, not fixed and absolute. So stories can be told in many ways, and the telling of stories has a direct implication for the characters within them. What we choose to focus on and remember also has a bearing on how we see ourselves. Our lives are so extensive that we can't remember every event, everything that happens to us. We tend to remember snapshots, and quite often those snapshots will give us a story, a narrative about ourselves, which can be helpful or less helpful. So our interpretation of our history impacts our emotional and physical well-being, and might therefore bring us in contact with services if there are difficulties that we experience as a consequence. So there are many possible stories for each series of events, and many different perspectives. So I guess the difference between stories and narratives is that a narrative is a thread that runs through a number of different stories that might reinforce something about us that is helpful or less helpful. Narrative therapy talks about thin versus thick descriptions, and one of the techniques within narrative therapy is to thicken descriptions, not reducing them down to a few core messages that we might have about ourselves, and also supporting the reauthoring of those stories. So these are the stages of the narrative approach. The first stage is defining the problem. So this begins by looking at the language used to determine if the service user sees themselves as a problem. So stories can become problem saturated. There may be dominant themes that you'll be listening out for, and you also need to listen for experiences or indicators that show exceptions, and note these and note the language used. Stage 2 is externalizing the problem. Often the service user will see the problem as intrinsic to them. They have become the problem, and in their view, others see them as a problem, so it's become internalized. Techniques at this stage include questioning about the effect of the problem. So for example, how is the problem affecting your relationship? And giving a name to the problem. This is service user led, and often it's metaphors or descriptive words that are used. Avoid normal emotional responses, for example, anger. But this helps to objectify the problem, which then frees the service user to explore times when the problem hasn't been as bad. Stage 3 is mapping the issues. So there are likely to be many strands, and as these issues are identified, practitioners can encourage exploration and see how these strands link to the main storyline. So by understanding how the problem affects the service user and others, look at their own influence on the evolution of the problem, but also remain alert to those exceptions. Stage 4 is deconstruction. So this is where the practitioner will aim to develop a thick description. So exploring who has told the story and what influences the telling of it. So there can be strong links with societal attitudes and family cultures at this stage. It's breaking down the problem into small components, accepting that we all have many different stories and alternative stories. Stage 5, delving deeper into exceptions to the problem-saturated narrative in order to re-story with an alternative narrative. So you've listened for some stories and found exceptions, and then working with the service user to develop this alternative, more positive narrative. Often in narrative therapy, letters and written narratives are used at this stage to reaffirm these alternative new stories. And stage 6 is the maintenance stage. So ideally there will be time to give space to test these alternative narratives, so to introduce them to family, to other networks, and so that the practitioner will explore how the development of that new narrative has gone. So that is the narrative approach. There will be some more resources for us to explore in terms of this approach, and I'm just going to share the references from today's presentation.